Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to day 2. I don't know about. I hope you had a nice evening. Were able to enjoy a dinner or enjoy the mall or wherever your adventures took you. Thank you for coming back. We are going to have a full day today, and today is the first day where we're going to move into our breakout sessions. And so, for those of you in the room and those of you online, look forward to that. Put your thinking caps on, and we're going to have some great small group conversations today. And I think that's really where the heart of the meeting will lie, is when you all are able to tell us what's on your mind. If you're not able to make it to the mic during our Q&As, we're so excited to hear from you in that way. So thank you for coming back. Thank you for being here. Thank you for engaging in this process. This morning, today as a whole is really split into two halves. In the first half of the day, we're really focusing in on what information the patients would like to know. We're going to shift focus in the afternoon to the professional side. What do the professionals want us to know about the metrics that would be most helpful, or what should the SRTR or the system as a whole be pursuing? I know HRSA's very engaged in this process and really wants to hear from you all what your thoughts are for where we should go with metrics in this field going forward. So that is the day. We're going to spend the morning talking about the patient perspective. We're going to shift focus in the afternoon and talk about the professional perspective. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Rachel Patzer from Emory. She is a professor and director of Health Services Research Center in the Department of Surgery at Emory University in Atlanta. And she's going to kick us off this morning. Rachel.
Great. Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to those of you that are here this morning and those of you that are online. I'm especially thrilled again. I think we've heard this sentiment a few times, but with the patients, how many patients are here in the room with us and joining us online. So we want to continue to hear from you, and this morning's session will be really important to raise your voice and continue to engage in the conversation. So I'm really looking forward to kicking off our discussion today. And for this session, I'm going to briefly introduce Jennifer Jones, who's our patient speaker for this morning. And then I'll follow up with some thoughts about yesterday, and then some of our goals for what we want to accomplish today before I turn it over to Corey, who will talk to us a little bit more detail about the what and what do we want to accomplish today. So I'm going to introduce Jennifer, who's joining us virtually. Jennifer Jones is a 2-time kidney transplant recipient. She first received an altruistic living donor in 2015 and a second deceased donor in 2021. She was diagnosed with membranoproliferative glomerulonephritis in 2011 after her kidneys declined while she was deployed to Afghanistan, serving in the U.S. Marines as a combat camera videographer. She's currently a member of the Executive Board of Directors for the American Association of Kidney Patients, the Patient and Family Advisory Council of Quality Insights Renal Network 5, the National KCER Patient and Family Engagement Learning and Action Network, and the Veterans Transplant Association and the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition. So you can tell just from me explaining all the different things that she's involved with that she's incredibly passionate about advocacy for policies that improve treatment and extend the life of patients with kidney disease. So thank you so much, Jennifer. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the SRTR People-Driven Transplant Metrics Consensus Conference. I apologize that I'm unable to be there in person as I received a second kidney transplant this past November, and on the advice of my transplant team, I am joining you remotely today. Like many other kidney patients, I was unexpectedly thrown into this kidney journey. In 2011, while serving in the United States Marine Corps, I was forward deployed to Afghanistan when I began exhibiting edema in my face and lower extremities. After being examined by the USMC medical team, it was determined that I had nephrotic syndrome and would need to be medically evacuated to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. After being evaluated for 2 weeks, it was determined that I should return to the States for a kidney biopsy and further evaluation. Ultimately, I was diagnosed with membranoproliferative glomerulonephritis type 1 idiopathic, and I already had stage 3 chronic kidney disease. In what felt like a blink of an eye, my entire life changed. I was medically retired from the Marines after proudly serving over 11 years. But once a Marine, always a Marine, even with kidney disease. Never in a million years did I think I would experience dialysis and receive a kidney transplant, not only once, but twice. In the beginning, I was younger and more reluctant to accept my current circumstances, and admittedly, I was a difficult patient. However, when my kidneys failed and I began in-center hemodialysis, I knew I had to make a decision to commit to what was expected of me as a patient and take an active role in my treatment and care. I have to admit that I don't recall if my transplant coordinator ever mentioned SRTR to me because my care center also had a transplant center. I didn't really consider looking at other transplant centers. I focused on pursuing a living donor after being told how long I could potentially have to wait on a donor list. I was so fortunate to not only have found an altruistic match after being on dialysis for only 8 months, but I had a transplant surgery date before I was even approved to be on a donor list. I was fortunate to not have any complications while on hemodialysis, and hospital visits were minimal. I received my first kidney transplant on April 2nd, 2015. Once I recovered and took some time to really figure out what I want to do with this second chance at life, I want to find a way to serve others who are navigating this life with chronic kidney disease. I decided to join the American Association of Kidney Patients, AAKP, the oldest and largest independent patient organization in the US. I joined because I strongly believe in their mission of improving the lives and long-term outcomes of kidney patients through education, advocacy, and substantive patient engagement. I knew how important it was for patients to share their voice and insights, because if it wasn't for me sharing my journey and experience through social media, I wouldn't have found a living donor. AAKP welcomed me with open arms and gave me plenty of opportunities to share my experiences as a patient on Capitol Hill, contribute to the creation of our peer mentorship program, and participate in committees, including the Task 5 Steering Committee. I was trusted and elected by my peers to become a member of the executive committee of the board of directors, and it's an honor that I do not take lightly. Which made it all the more difficult when the function in my transplanted kidney began to rapidly decline at the beginning of 2020, coinciding with the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. After a kidney biopsy, it was determined that MPGN was causing acute kidney damage, and I was experiencing severe anemia with my hemoglobin being down to 5.4. I was privileged to have a nephrology team who worked with me to do everything possible to prolong the function of this kidney. I also spent numerous stints in the hospital, having to receive 3 blood transfusions. Ultimately, at the end of January 2021, after spending another 3 weeks in the hospital, I was discharged with both a chest catheter and a PD catheter, and would have to do in-center hemodialysis until I was trained to do PD at home. Coincidentally, the next day, I received my formal invitation to the Task 5 Steering Committee to represent as a transplant recipient. A new mission I said yes to, because once a Marine, always a Marine. I was placed in a unique position to discuss which metrics a patient requires when making an informed choice about their transplant center. I also had an opportunity to think hard about what transplant metrics I would like to see adopted for my own hospital transplant center, and I was curious to see their metrics. Although it was a relief knowing that they are willing to take on patients with rare diseases like mine, I wish that there were metrics included for patients who had already received a transplant. Was there a difference in graft survival for a second transplant? I decided to share this information with my peers who were also initially unaware of SRTR. I have a friend who was on the list at the same transplant center for a few years, and when he turned 76, they removed him from the list, despite the fact he did not have any other underlying conditions. He was very upset, understandably so, and didn't understand why this action had been taken or why he had not been fully informed in advance. After we went over the transplant center metrics, we discovered that this center is below the US average for waiting list registrations for individuals over 70 years of age. After further investigation, it was found that this was actually a common occurrence. If my friend would have known this in advance, as a patient consumer, he would have taken the time to make a more informed decision about where to seek his care and where to take his health business. To be clear, he would have sought out other transplant centers instead of waiting years at just this one facility. For me, I was very fortunate to receive a transplant from a deceased donor after only 10 months of being on dialysis, despite being highly sensitized. Being able to make an informed care choice about a transplant center that can quickly match a patient based on their diagnosis and demographics is crucial. My story and the story about my older friend who also awaited a transplant are powerful reminders about the importance of our right to patient care choice and the need for fully transparent metrics and accountability in the process. AAKP has fought for over 50 years for the principle of care choice. We believe quality care means the choice of the right treatment at the right time so that patients can pursue their aspirations regardless of this disease. This means kidney treatments must align and support the patient's goals of part-time or full-time work, home ownership, having a family, and a secure retirement. Make no mistake about it. There has been a revolution in kidney medicine among patient consumers. Our expectations for clarity, transparency, and responsiveness in the transplant process have increased tremendously over the past 10 years because we know we are the ultimate consumer in the transplant process. In that same period of time, our capacities and effectiveness as advocates to impact national policy have also expanded. In Congress, we can help pass good legislation and we can stop bad legislation. Consider the role kidney patient consumers have had in crafting and achieving positive policy changes in the past 10 years. In 2013, patient groups like AAKP helped secure congressional authorization of HIV positive to HIV positive organ transplants. In 2018, patients met directly with the Department of Labor and helped gain significant living organ donor protections under the Family Medical Leave Act. In 2019, patients met with the Secretary of HHS to help shape the executive order on advancing American kidney health. And in 2020, patient advocates were heavily involved in efforts to secure lifetime immunosuppressive drug coverage for transplanted kidneys. The American transplant system and kidney patient consumers face many challenges at this point in history. We need to work together to improve it. And we must keep patients like me and my older friend at the forefront of our deliberations. And we must also be united in rejecting policy proposals that can undermine the principle of patient care choice or that interfere with the doctor-patient relationship. In the past 6 months, AAKP has seen 2 such transplant policy proposals, both of which we reject as an organization. In the first instance, a transplant organization is seeking to encourage the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Assistance to adopt a mandatory requirement for patients to undergo palliative care training before they can access dialysis care or be listed on the transplant list. AAKP believes this would be an overreach of government. Instead of trying to discourage people from pursuing a transplant or diminishing their hopes, we should all be doing more to increase the number of available organs. In the second instance, AAKP has reviewed a legislative proposal that essentially calls the current national transplant process a failure. In its place, the authors seek to nationalize the American transplant process, a government takeover that would put key decisions in the subjective hands of political appointees, not transplant professionals, and definitely not patient consumers or advocates. AAKP will work hard to defeat this legislation based on principle. So, as we move forward with this conference, and with the potential recommendations we make. Let us remember those who are on the waiting list and those who have succumbed to their illness before they ever received the gift of life. Because any recommendations that appear under the adjective of consensus must reflect their equities as well, with the same weight as the equities of providers, professionals, and industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your advocacy. What you are doing is so inspiring. Thank you for continuing to advocate for patients. So I'm going to go ahead and turn now to try to summarize a little bit of yesterday, and then we'll talk a little bit about the goals for today. So yesterday we got to hear from so many of you that are really critical to the development of transplant metrics. Patients, family members, donors, deceased donor family members, referring providers, payers, regulators, and transplant providers. There are so many of us that are key stakeholders to developing transplant metrics. The NASM report was brought up so many times yesterday, and I think this is a clearly well-written document that calls for equity in transplant. It calls for alignment across our whole health system with important recommendations for metrics that really offers us a guidepost for where we want to go and what we want to do. So hopefully we'll be referring back to that as our guiding, some of our guiding principles for what we want to do, where we want to go. There was a lot of discussion yesterday about the denominator. Really lots of rich discussion about the need for getting more information to patients sort of upstream of or prior to when patients are even on the waiting list. We heard Jennifer speak to that point as well. We are in a room now where we have a lot of people that are really familiar with the transplant process. Maybe we've been touched by transplant in some way, treating patients, or we've got transplant recipients. We have fewer people here who may have end organ failure, who may be less familiar with transplant. So we need to be able to engage that patient population in our discussion to make sure those voices are heard. So when we talk about this denominator in kidney disease, when we have 14% of the population with chronic kidney disease, or 37 million people, and over 700,000 patients with end-stage kidney failure, and then we think about what we're specifically thinking about for 90,000 patients on the waiting list, or 24,000 kidney transplant recipients, those are small populations when we might want to be thinking about that sort of upstream population. And similar for other organs where we don't really have that data, thinking about that denominator. Who are these patients that are in need of a transplant? So hopefully we heard a lot of comments about that yesterday. Hopefully that will continue to be part of the conversation today. And then the subway map that we are referring back to just so much. I love that visual. I think we all really love that visual. Thank you, Corey, for that. And we really need to know, how do we even get patients on the train? How do we even get them referred for transplant? And we heard a lot of conversations yesterday that even social workers who may be the ones responsible for helping, educating, and referring patients for transplant may not even be aware that SRTR exists. And as one person commented yesterday, that this was a marketing problem, and it must be addressed. How do we get this information in the hands of the people that really need it most? Many people mentioned yesterday that we need more data, both pre-waitlisting and also longer-term data beyond just 1 and 3 years. And we heard yesterday from Dr. Saxena that Kaiser already uses a lot of pre-waitlisting data to improve the quality of care of their Kaiser patients. And that's something that we could potentially talk more about. How do we model that nationally? And then longer-term outcomes, we heard about that a lot from patients. This is incredibly important for patients beyond this early 1-3 time year period, especially for pediatric patients. So we heard a little bit about that yesterday. We heard a lot about discussions around sort of system metrics versus metrics for transplant centers, and talked about the different audiences. Our quality metrics for the patients primarily, they're also used for many other settings, the transplant programs, regulators, payers. So how can we balance the needs for all of these audience in the SRTR report, but really prioritizing the patients? And then we talked a lot about the importance of equity and person-centered metrics and making data more accessible to patients. And kind of overall, my overarching thoughts as my OPTN Data Advisory Committee Chair. I just finished my 2-year term, and so with that hat on, it seemed like many of the comments that we had from yesterday really spoke to the need for more information in many of these paths in this subway map. And I think that's just incredibly important to reflect upon today. And I will say, from sort of as a realist and knowing how much work it takes to collect these data, how important the data are, we're going to have to prioritize what data is most important. And so I think some of the exercises that we'll do today in the breakouts will be really important for the prioritization of some of these data points, information for what we want. And we'll need your help, both those of you in the room and those of you that are online. Okay, so a few points about today. First, again, I want to emphasize this point about quality metrics are really primarily first and foremost to inform patient choice and to help patients. Certainly we have these other objectives of metrics, but this is really going to be the focus of this morning's discussion. We'll hear some information about some data results from Dr. Hart and her team on patient focus groups and results on what patients want to know, and hear from the patients in our breakout groups and come back. Let's use this subway map as our guide for what we want to, how we want to inform patients for what information they want to consider for considering a transplant all the way through the transplant process. And second is, I think, aligning ourselves to the goals we want to meet. So Rio said this yesterday, and I wanted to reiterate this really incredibly important point, that ultimately we need to think about what do we want as success in our field. Is it to save more lives? Is it, and if so, whose lives? Are they the lives of what population? What denominator are we thinking about? Who is this population? Is it the end organ kidney failure, the end organ liver failure patients? Are we really focusing on waitlisted patients? How do we want to also balance our equity? Equity is so important here. We talk a lot about equity and access as a field that's very important to me as a researcher that I've done a lot of research in, and I think we really want to be careful not to forget about how do we think about metrics and how that might influence different patient populations and groups or different geographic regions. And so I'm thinking about that today too. So that hopefully those goals can then drive our discussion about what data do we need to meet that. So think about goals first, then about what information you need to meet that goal. So then in the afternoon, we will have our session dedicated to what the professionals want, what information do they want and need. And today, again, won't focus on specific metrics and developing these specific metrics. We'll do that tomorrow. So instead, we really want to encourage everyone to raise their voice about the what. What do patients want to know? What do professionals want to know about the various aspects of the transplant process, including diagnosis of organ failure, the referral, listing, multi-listing processes. Jennifer raised a really good point, too, about the retransplant process, of course, the organ offers, the transplant and post-transplant process. All of those will be really important. We want to consider all of that in our process. And I think this will really help us set up the goal of developing these metrics for tomorrow. So we'll be armed with the information for today. We'll be collating that, and we'll use that for our discussions tomorrow and how we will actually do this. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Corey Schaffhausen, who is we met him yesterday, the SRTR Human-Centered Design Engineer, and he will talk a little bit about the gaps and where we need to focus and defining the what. Great.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit of an overview, some of the materials we have seen yesterday, but just as a refresher, and then we'll take a little bit more of a detailed look at what we have planned for the breakout sessions today. Let's see. I am attempting to advance slides. Is this? Great. Let's see, I've gone too far. Okay, try again. So this is just maybe some quick keywords, and I'm going to kind of talk through what I mean by this. So the discussions about transplant information should be inclusive, systematic, and open-ended. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So this is the map that we've been looking at and talking about over the last day. So as we advance into the next phase of these breakouts, a couple points. One is because this is what I think we could consider a complex system. It's far-reaching, a lot of moving parts. In order to try and have a manageable discussion, we have tried to break this system into little more manageable pieces. And so each of you in the room has a printout that is a breakout session guide, and some of the sheets on there, for one of them, I think it's page 3, has a list of these maps, and each of the maps is mostly grayed out. And there's some of the lines that are in color for each of the topics of the breakout, and those would be the focus areas for the topic that you're in. So as you advance to your breakout, you'll know what topic you are in. We have a list of names and what groups you're in, and you can see, okay, for this group, we're only looking at these 1 or 2 lines. And the rest of those lines, we're not ignoring, the rest of those lines are other groups. And then at the end, we can combine all of that feedback from the different groups, from the different parts of the system, to get a full understanding in a systematic way. Also keep in mind that our conference, both in the room and virtually, has individuals who represent all of these different stakeholder groups, and they might be in the room with you, and they may not have the same background and experience as you do. They may not be familiar with all of the regulations and policies and all of the types of data that might impact you. And so it's important just to recognize that we want to have this to be an inclusive discussion where we keep the jargon and technical details to a minimum for this phase. And so that is the intentional reason why the initial part, the initial focus for these breakouts is on the what is important. So anyone in the room can articulate, can describe what is important to yourself or to the individuals who are in your stakeholder group. And you don't need to have a detailed background about the statistics or the policy. You can just express what's important to you, and that's exactly what we want to hear in these meetings today. So again, this is the stage that we are at. We will advance to other parts of this map tomorrow. So if there are things that are really important that involve risk adjustment or really detailed analysis of the data, that should be in the discussion tomorrow. So hopefully we can sort of separate that a little bit and keep the discussion today a little bit more general, focused on just information that's important. Again, the morning sessions are focused on patients, donors, and families. And so this would be maybe, again, just a partial list of things we've already heard, things we recognize may be discussed again, and that's fine. If you also want to expand into more detail and include new things that are not on this list, definitely please do. This is just listed as general questions that a patient may want to ask. They may want answers to. That's exactly the scope of comments that we want to hear. It doesn't have to be phrased as a metric. It doesn't have to be phrased as a statistic. We just want to know what's important. If it's phrased as a question, that is perfectly fine. The materials that we've circulated, and for the individuals who are joining online, we're working to have instructions posted to the CVent platform so that prior to beginning the breakout sessions virtually, you'll have some of the same information for your groups that is comparable to what's provided to the in-person individuals. This is a list of some of the prompts that you might see on the materials that are provided. These are just prompts. They're guides. You're welcome to follow these guides, but if you have your own way of thinking about this, your own way of expressing what's important, you should do whatever is comfortable that you can, that works for you to express what's important. But these are some examples. I'm not sure what to choose for. I wish I could. And I think that's a really helpful one because we do want to capture parts of the system that may not exist today. We can think about aspirations for how the system could look in the future. And then you could also think about information about something helps me to, and then kind of fill in those blanks, like what is your goal? What is the information that might be helpful? And really, to just reiterate a final time, this is really the level of detail that we hope we can stay at for the discussions today. Just to give a quick 5-second math problem, we do have 90 minutes dedicated to each of these 3 breakouts. So it sounds like a lot of time, and we do plan to have almost all of that dedicated to discussion amongst the attendees. But these groups might have about 20 individuals approximately. It varies a little bit, but that still leaves maybe less than 5 minutes per person. So we do need to capture this succinctly, try to stay on topic, and keep it general. There isn't enough time in that, to allow everyone to kind of get into the details, get into the specifics. This is, I think, something that's come up in earlier talks as well. There is information that's important that SRTR and other groups don't have right now. So we want to know that it's important, even if we can't necessarily say that, yes, we will share that. If we don't have it, we may not be able to share it, but we won't be able to collect it unless we have the input from this group that it's necessary, that we need to put the process in motion to start collecting it. But there is a lot of data that is available. We saw some summaries of that yesterday, what's already on the website, what reports are available. And if you want to highlight specific instances of data that are already on reports, that is also really helpful, because as we've also discussed, it is really critical to move forward and make it easier for patients and every other stakeholder to find that information. And so if we have the priorities of what of this vast sea of information we really want to focus on, that's the guidance we need to move forward and say, okay, when you land on our webpage, what is the information that we really want to put front and center? And we can do a better job on our site to do that, but having this input to focus in on even what's already available will be really helpful. So the last thing I want to reiterate is the comment Rachel already made. We do want to take a preliminary step at prioritizing. And we recognize that just by virtue of the mix of attendees and the fact that we have some attendees in person and other attendees virtually, and lastly, that the proportion is somewhat different. So the proportion of professionals who are in the room may be higher for the in-person group, and virtually the proportion of patients may be higher. So as we split into these groups and we start to discuss what are the most important pieces of information, we may hear different things from the in-person groups or virtual groups. Again, there's a lot of diversity of different stakeholders involved. So it will be difficult to say at the end if one group has suggested these items are the top priority, that is the definitive response, because a different group may have something else that has risen to the top of their priorities. And so it'll be a process that we involve stakeholders at to take all of that data and kind of analyze and interpret that and make comparisons for what we heard in different groups, depending on whether there's mostly professionals, mostly patients, a mix. All of these things will come into play. I do want to talk very quickly about the process. Again, we will be posting more information on the CVIT platform, and the in-person individuals have hard copies of some of the guides for these sessions. But in order to accomplish some of this, for the in-person sessions, we'll be breaking out into different corners of this large room and also different smaller rooms. There will be a combination of writing down information individually and also sharing it amongst the group. So for in-person, you will have a worksheet. It's included in your packet. There's one for each session, so you'll have 3 sheets. And for the individual portion, we just ask that you write down the things that are important to yourself on your own sheet. And if your name is on that sheet, so please put your name on the sheet, when we collect that, we will have a way to track what we're hearing from different stakeholder groups, because we can identify what group you're at, whether you're a regulator, an OPO professional, a patient, based on the fact that you put your name on the sheet and you wrote down what's important. Once we transition to a group discussion, the in-person group will have a chance to discuss, react, build off of each other's comments, and the moderators will take notes on a large flip chart. To prioritize, at the very end of the discussion, each individual will have a small strip of stickers. And this, again, will just be a preliminary way to start gauging what the priorities might be, and each individual can put their mark on the flip chart next to the items that they would like to say are their priorities. So we'll have a combination. You'll have your own sheet where you can enter the information just on your own. We'll also have this group deliverable after the discussion and prioritization as a group. For the virtual participants, this will be a Zoom meeting. So it'll be slightly different than the Q&A sessions during the discussions yesterday. These will be Zoom meetings where you can discuss, your audio will be active, and you can also use the chat feature. And we encourage you to use the chat feature because this will attach your name to the information you enter in the chat for the same reason. At the end, we can keep those chat records, and we'll have a record of what each individual comment, or who each individual comment came from, and what group they represent. And then that chat is also a way to react to each other's comments, to read what they're saying. You can discuss it amongst yourselves. And then at the very end of those virtual sessions, we are hoping that you can also indicate in the chat what your high priorities would be for yourself. So with that, I think I will close. Prior to the actual breakout sessions, we'll have a little bit more specific logistics, what button to click, what room to go to. So we'll cover that in the later session. Okay, thank you. The next group will be What Do Patients, Living Donors, and Their Families Want? With moderators Allison Hart and Amin Tabatabai. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel, for that welcoming session, and for Jennifer and Corey and all the information. I hope you're excited. This is where we get a chance to talk today. So bringing up our panelists now, we have a great panel ahead, and our moderators are Allison Hart here and Amin Tabatabai, who I've gotten to know over the last year as a member of our Patient and Family Affairs Committee, and we're so thankful to have him here. And data scientist, I mean, this man of my own heart here. So we have a fantastic panel ahead. I'll let Allison introduce them when the time comes, but we're going to start with a distillation of a lot of great work that was done ahead of time. Dr. Hart and her team and Dr. Ledeen helped to analyze 20 patient focus groups leading up to this meeting, where we had a number of patients and family members involved, and they're going to begin by giving us a summary of that work. So, Allison, I will turn to you.
Thank you so much. So, going into this conference, as the Senior Staff for Patient and Family Affairs, I'm a nephrologist at Hippin Healthcare, which is a safety net hospital here in Minneapolis, and an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. And my academic career has really led me more and more toward patient engagement. And so my perspective for this whole conference was, how do we actually not just have patients and family members in the room, but how can we get them fully engaged and really hear what they have to say, knowing that this is 3 days is a long time for us to take out of our lives. On the other hand, it's nothing for the scope of work that we're trying to accomplish. So we wanted to get as much information from patient and family stakeholders as possible coming in. So we decided to conduct some focus groups. Some of these are interviews just because we were trying to help work around patient schedules to get a little bit more information coming in about what patients and family members want to know. So that's what I'm going to present to you today. These slides are wordy. Qualitative data is by definition words. So we're also working to upload to CVent a little bit more of a descriptive overview if you want to see more quotes, a little bit more information about what we did. I would like to give a huge shout out to Dr. Ledeen, who helped us with this process. So I think, especially when it comes to qualitative data, to do a really good job, you want a lot of people reading these transcripts and getting together to make sure that we report back what people actually said, not what we think we said or what we remember they said. And I'm hoping the slides will come up. Wait for it. Yeah. So we were helped by, again, Dr. Ledeen was huge in this process, Dr. McKinney, who is here at the SRTR, as well as Julia Perugini and Christina Gonzalez in Dr. Ledeen's lab. The focus group guides were developed with a lot of input. So I want to give a huge shout out to our Patient and Family Advisory Council with the SRTR. So a lot of iterative drafts that went through the steering committee for this conference, patients, the steering committee for the SRTR. A lot of people looked at this. We wanted to recruit broadly, so we wanted to hear not just from folks who are already fully engaged in the process. I know Richard Knight is a really big advocate for this. There are a lot of patients who are already on boards, who know what's going on, and we really, those voices are so valuable. We also want to hear from people who are on the ground now who don't necessarily know all of this and hear their struggles as well. So we recruited broadly, and it ended up being really successful. Most of the folks that we heard from had never heard of the SRTR. So that's where we wanted to start. Let's see, I feel like that was just there. So the focus groups were conducted by me and Dr. Schaffhausen. We started very broad, so we started with a description of the experience of getting information that patients and families needed or wanted about transplant. And then we got a little bit more specific, ended up showing what kind of data are available currently within the SRTR database so that we could get more specific feedback, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And then researchers who were not involved in actually conducting those focus groups read those transcripts and coded them, and then as a group we got together to talk about what those codes meant. This is a breakdown of the groups we talked to. You can see we tried hard to get a broad representation. We talk a lot about patients and families. It rolls off the tongue. This is a very diverse stakeholder group, even within the patient and family stakeholder group. So we talked to a lot of different types of recipients from the different organ systems. We talked to candidates as much as we could. A lot of my research has been actually qualitative work with candidates. So as you know, that's a hard group because they tend to be really sick. They're trying to get transplanted. So we did talk to a few candidates in this work. We talked to living donors, got our pediatric representation, so thank you for that, and some deceased donor family members. We also were looking for a broad representation in terms of race. We know that there are a lot of racial disparities that we still need to tackle. Again, all of this information will be available to you. So for this presentation, we wanted to present what we heard about information that was important to people when they were first going through this process, wherever they entered the subway, where they got their information, what gaps were there, and then in seeing what is out there in terms of the potential, what kind of data are available now, what was their reaction to that, as well as some things that came up that we didn't ask about but that were clearly important. In general, again, what we heard varied a lot by the stakeholder group, but we heard a lot of information, people looking when they were first going through their process, looking for information about outcomes or success rates, both in the US in general, learning about their own disease, their own process, and also center-specific. People were interested in wait times, where the centers even were located. We also heard a lot about looking for information about peer support. We heard that loud and clear yesterday, availability of support groups, sponsored by programs or not, variation in things like surgical techniques or donor options, living donor exchange, and a lot of patients who were actually seeking out centers that had a robust research program so that they could be involved in those opportunities. The sources were broad, so a lot of people said, well, I talked to my doctors, that's where I got my information. A lot of people went to what they called Dr. Google, especially if they felt like they weren't getting enough information or they didn't understand the information that they were getting. Word of mouth, patients and peers, a lot of folks ended up finding what they wanted or needed, or at least seeking what they wanted from patient groups. I liked the Barbara Walters comment. It's one person apparently got nicknamed Barbara Walters because she just asked so many questions. There were a few people who had heard of the SRTR, and so it certainly wasn't the majority, but there were folks who said, yes, I've heard of the SRTR. Another person said, I physically called dozens of centers. It took a really long time, and it was really challenging. The experience, what was the experience getting or finding information? It was hard. The description was that it was almost universally really hard for patients and family members to get the information that they wanted or felt like they needed. A few other people said, you know, it's not that there isn't information, the question is it accurate? Is it trustworthy information? And then a lot of comments about how when there was information, it was jargon. They didn't understand it anyway. Looking for visuals, they found a lot of numbers, but just didn't have the tools that they needed to interpret those. So again, really beautiful quotes. We're starting from a massive information deficit, and we're not medical experts, so we end up going to Dr. Google. What's factual and what's not, that's what the challenge is. Patients commenting either on being able to compare centers, whether they were able to do that, or in discussing about whether being able to compare centers would be important. We heard that patients wanted to be able to compare centers. I like the idea of making or considering having two centers side by side to compare. Another participant talked about how the program itself showed their data in comparison with national data, and that they felt like that was, they felt like they could really trust their center when they heard that information. In terms of the SRTR, overwhelmingly we heard that the data potentially that are potentially available from the SRTR are incredibly valuable. That this could be or is a trustworthy source of information, that it could provide information about variation between centers, manage expectations, build confidence in decision making, generate hope for candidates and families, support patient advocacy. So we've heard a lot. Again, a lot of the folks in this room and online started off not knowing anything, and that really lit their fire to be advocates. And to facilitate shared decision-making between providers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. A lot of people felt like the SRTR website could be sort of the landing point when you're just trying to find out what you need to know. And then how can we support dissemination? So again, that PR campaign, how do people even know that this is available? So some quotes. I definitely think if I had known about this website during the process, even if I couldn't make heads or tails of the information, my brother and my mother, this was somebody with hepatic encephalopathy, they could have used this even if I couldn't, and that could help them just see what I was going through or help with decisions. I love that you have all this option on the website, because there are parents out there that have just been thrown into this whole world they know nothing about. Again, we have a lot more quotes that will be available to you to see, but all of the different stakeholder groups really felt like the ability to access information was going to be important. Now, all of that said, while there was a lot of enthusiasm about the value of data, there are a lot of unmet needs. There's a lot of work to be done. So loud and clear, no matter who we talk to, and this wasn't news to us, so there was no shock on our part. We need to adapt the site to better serve patients and family members. So again, improve the awareness. A lot of patients said, this is amazing. I'm not sure how to navigate it, and I had no idea it existed. Reduce jargon and statistical displays. How do we get the information to folks in a way that's actually digestible? The navigation was huge, so we need interactive features that help the person getting to that website, depending on who they are, where they are in the process, get to what information they need, using, for example, perhaps a question-based guide to get patients where they need to go. We can provide information on the system as a whole, again, talking about system metrics versus individual program or OPO metrics, and help patients understand what factors most affect patient-centered outcomes, and then helping patients understand how data can account for complexity of patients. So we heard that a lot. Well, again, who will transplant patients like me, or is this a program that will take more risk? We heard a lot about requests for information for success rates or outcomes, and again, that's the work of this conference. How do we translate that into information, into metrics, however you want to frame that? We need to provide the ability to compare centers on different aspects that are important to patients and family members. We need to provide long-term outcomes. I'm not sure how many times that's been said, but that's certainly clear. And then not just monitor equity, but by monitoring it, by keeping it front and center on everybody's mind so that we can continue to do this work and we don't get complacent. I love this quote. It comes up no matter what work I'm doing. You don't know what you don't know. And it came up again unprompted with these focus groups. You have to know what to ask. I didn't know, and I guess a lot of other people looking for transplant, they don't know. And even if you do know what to ask, you don't know where to look. Another person said, I made a comment earlier that one thing we talked about a lot, you don't know what you don't know, and that leads to a lot of fear and anxiety. For the patient who is on the waiting list, we're stressed. We don't want to think. Our mind is already in a million places. That was really the situation I was in when I had a big stack of papers. So this is someone who's given information, but I couldn't decide what was relevant. So overwhelm is something that we hear. So we need to provide a roadmap. If you don't know what you don't know what questions to ask, you don't know where you should go looking, that is an unmet need that we can talk about here. So what is helpful is knowing what question to ask, and then how do we array the data in a way that's driven by ordinary language questions? That's the key issue that we face. Is there a way to simplify it so that we can help people navigate? It's quite a bit of information, and some people may become overwhelmed just by looking at the site. So you say it's too much and you just leave. So is there a roadmap to help people go from A to B? Another question that I think is we need to grapple with, how can the SRTR help with information that is at least currently outside the SRTR scope? It's not currently on our website. We've heard this, the availability of support groups, patient and family networks, cost considerations, variations in clinical practice, program participation in living donor exchange. This is information that we don't currently have on our website. So in summary, getting accurate, digestible information was challenging for patients and family members who were thrown into this process. They felt like the SRTR data that's already available is valuable, but not a lot of awareness, it's underutilized. Patients and families also care about information that is not currently reported or captured. They want the ability to compare centers with each other and national averages as well. And we need to help patients answer questions that they didn't know to ask. I'm going to defer the questions just in the interest of hearing from the much more important people up here on the stage with me, but we'll have some Q&A at the end, and again, there will be a lot more detail on those focus groups provided to you. All right. So I'm hoping that the panel faces will show up very soon. Wait for it. While we're waiting, we'll make use of our time. I'm going to let my amazing co-moderator introduce himself. Is that okay? Yep. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amin Tabatabai. Liver transplant about 12 years ago, and then decided to pursue biomedical engineering, and then also got certified in plant-based nutrition. Since then, started my career in Silicon Valley, and then now in Hollywood, focused on data and humanizing that data and helping business folks make data-driven decisions. So this bridge between transplant and data is really a passion of mine. And I think, kind of before I get into some of my comments as a patient, but also from my, data perspective, just wanted to say how great is this, right? With everyone in the room right now, we're taking a system that's great, that's saving lives, and we're trying to make it incredible, right? You don't really see that all the time, is when something's doing well, people try to make it better, right? So I think let's take a moment and be grateful for, everyone that's here today, right? So pre-transplant, illness was my identity. I was diagnosed with, multiple autoimmune diseases, primary sclerosing cholangitis at the age of 10. So it was really all I knew, and it sort of took me down a different path. I remember the first time my primary care doctor told me, "Oh, you can't play basketball anymore. You're gonna get hit, and whatnot." So I was like, "Okay, I need to choose a different path, right?" And every year, every month that went by, I continued to get sicker and sicker. So everyone knew me as the sickest person they knew, and they didn't want to be in my seat. And that was about 8 years of my life. So I really had no idea what to expect because that was kind of my reality, right? So pre-transplant was really grim, and any data I looked at got scary, right? It pretty much said I was gonna die. From age 10 to 18, like I didn't really know what data I was looking at. I'm still learning algebra, fractions, and everything in school. So I was navigating that, and then kind of going down that path of transplant. I remember being in the doctor's office, and the doctor told me, you have about 12 months to live. And I'm like, whoa, what does that even mean? But we can transplant you. So I said, okay, well, how long is that going to take, right? Because I know I have 12 months. Well, based on your blood type, it's going to take 3 weeks or 3 years. I was like, okay, I better go pray. And then I was also like, okay, maybe I should look for the research too. Are these numbers really true or not? So that was kind of where my interest in research and all of that started, because I wanted to know what are the real numbers, but what is the newest numbers coming out? What's the research study that came out yesterday, right? And with that, I think for me, noticing how different it was as I started going down that transplant path and talking to the surgeons and getting closer to post-transplant, the data and the conversation started to go more positive, right? I remember going in and at that first consultation with the surgeon, and Dr. Reyes from University of Washington said, you know what, livers can last 200 years. And I said, whoa. At first I was like, this has to be true. It's coming from a surgeon. But that sort of gave me hope, because I was like, okay, I may not live to be 200, but this liver will last me the rest of my life. So those kinds of data was super helpful. And I think for me, it was more about you are really what you believe in, right? So if you believe you can go further and you see the data that confirms that, it sort of helps you become that, right? And then another example of data was that post-transplant, Dr. Bhakta from University of Washington, he came to me post-transplant, he looked at me and he said, my work is done. This is 90% on you now, right? So thinking about those use cases of the data, I think what really went far for me there was the story and the context and the emotion in which it was delivered to me, right? The data may have not been real, but the context and story was what gave me hope and said, okay, I can do this. And that shifted my perspective. And I said, show me the records. And I asked the doctor, I said, what's the most years you've seen someone be with a transplant? And I remember Dr. Reyes said it was somewhere around 50 years. I was like, okay, that's a challenge for me. So it really shifted my perspective, right? So I think thinking about, how do we want to deliver this, right? And I'll also note that it was really different for myself versus my parents. I didn't want my parents to hear everything because I knew that they were emotional, right? I was their child. They were looking at me and saying, it's out of our control. It's on him and it's on the doctors, right? So they couldn't really control it. But for myself, I was like, tell me everything, because I felt like I had some control and I wanted to know what was there, right? I was open to the challenge. So that's kind of a little bit of the different perspective there, is like, I wanted to hear it all, but my parents didn't, right? So I think that speaks to, kind of what data we want to, to talk about with who. And I think it speaks a lot about, emotions that are projected on data, right? Because it either confirms our doubt and fears, or it can give us hope, right? If we're feeling a certain way and we look at the data, yeah, we might see that the survival percent is 70%, right? But what about that 30%, right? So it can confirm sort of how we feel. So that's where it's like, if the information and the data and the stories, that's where we can really create some hope and possibility, but it comes through that relatability, right? If it doesn't make sense, I think we get lost in trying to find our own interpretation or confirming our doubts and our fears. So I think really it's all about painting the picture and understanding that data is the color. We don't want a black and white picture, right? We want one that's vibrant with the colors, and that's the context that we get, right? Because part of it's like, what does this data mean for me? And I think for me, it's understanding, like, how do you humanize that data, right? Because, thinking about the number of diverse transplant recipients and all the diseases that are represented in a base, it may not represent that patient, right? For myself, I was like, show me the records. I saw it more of a challenge. So I think that speaks to a little bit of that. And one of the things I wanted to say is, like, in the data world, one of the things that I always say is data is the new oil, but you really have to know where and how to mine it and which engine to fuel it in, right, to drive, right? And I think with that, I don't know about you, but I want that 91 octane, right? I want the data that really tells me what I want to know. And I think with that, one of the things I wanted to share was when I woke up from my transplant, it was different, right? Any data, anything I'd looked at before was crushed, right? Because it was more about how I was feeling, right? I kind of woke up in this in this new body. The liver that I'd received was now integrated, and it really just felt like I was in a new body, and my old limits were somewhat gone, right? But I think for me, it was about these new boundaries that were meant to be pushed. And I think for me, what I was looking about was like, what can I really achieve? So I wanted to see the data that was longer term. Where can I go with this, right? And I think with that, it's about, let's help transplant recipients understand that this is the data that you need to see, as in, what is that new identity gonna be? What is that new normal for you? What is that new world gonna look like, right? And I think with that, it's the color that we bring to the data that we speak to. Thank you.
I think we have. Can see you better. Anyway, I think we have Dr. Hippin on the line. He was unable to join with us, so we'll flip it to Dr. Hippin. Yay, there you are. Please.
Good morning, and thank you. I especially want to thank the organizers of the conference for this invitation. My name is Ben Hippin. I'm the head of transplant medicine for Fresenius Medical Care, and I was invited to provide the referrer perspective. Prior to joining Fresenius about a year ago, I spent my entire professional career in a community nephrology practice, mostly as a transplant nephrologist, but also as a general nephrologist. I was the medical director of a large 150 patient in-center hemodialysis facility for 13 years, and for many years also served as medical director of a large home dialysis facility in Greater Charlotte. Unique to many transplant nephrologists, I really had the opportunity in my professional experience to be on both sides, both on the referring physician side as well as on the transplant center side. So to that end, I want to start by outlining what I think is, from the vantage of a referring physician for physicians who take care of kidney disease, the most important measurement that I think that patients should value. It's not the only measurement that patients should value, but I do think, and we'll try and make the case to you, that it is far and away the most important one. And I want to underscore that I'm talking about measurements here today and not about information, of which we have plenty, and not about metrics, which have a particular valence with regard to how transplant centers are regulated and paid, but really want to talk about a patient-focused measurement. And to my mind, the most important patient-focused measurement is providing patients with the information of what their access is to an actual transplant, not to a referral, not to an opportunity to be on the waiting list, but access to an actual transplant in the shortest period of time for patients who look like my patient. I think Jennifer Jones put it more succinctly and eloquently than I ever could about the importance of relativizing this information to the patient in front of the referring physician. To that end, there's quite a lot of information in the available SRTR data sheets by Transplant Center, but I think that the measurements that are available through, say, transplantcentersearch.org, which is really patient-focused, and again, isn't perfect, is very much in the spirit of the sort of measurements that patients should care the most about. Now, again, it's not exhaustive as to what patients should care about, but again, I think it's the most important. Is it more important than one-year patient and graft survival? I think it is. Why? Because I think if you look at the outcomes for patients with end-stage kidney disease on any kind of dialysis modality out to 5, 7, or 8 years, you'll find that even the lowest performing transplant centers in terms of one-year patient and graft survival are conferring more benefit in terms of patient and graft survival from successfully transplanting patients than for patients remaining on either in-center home dialysis, in-center hemodialysis, or any home modality. So to that extent, I really think that from a referring provider perspective, being able to provide my patients with information about which transplant centers are most likely to get them transplanted the soonest is far and away the most important. Now, while this patient-focused measure is not the same as a metric, prioritizing this particular measure does imply a certain regime of metrics that incentivize certain behaviors and avoid certain unintended consequences. The sort of behaviors that this sort of measure would incentivize is encouraging transplant centers to be more aggressive in their organ acceptance behaviors. I learned recently from Sumit Mohan, who's with you in person there, that the discard rate in the United States first quarter of 2022 reached an all-time high of 29%. This is simply unacceptable. Our colleagues in the EU and in France, for example, have a discard rate closer to 10%. We need to create a system of metrics that aggressively incentivize transplant programs to be more aggressive in their organ acceptance behaviors. And we need to recognize that this will come with some trade-offs. It will come at the expense of overall one-year patient and graft survival. But I think these trade-offs are something that we can be forthright about, that we can have an adult conversation about, and can accept that it's better to broaden access to transplantation for more people generally, even if it means that our sky-high one-year patient and graft survival is a little bit less. As somebody who spent their entire career taking care of patients with CKD, ESKD, and transplantation in a longitudinal fashion, I also want to make a plea for the downstream side of the subway path that was beautifully illustrated the other day. Specifically, I think we need to pay attention to, in an ideal situation, very long-term outcomes and how care is coordinated across the entire patient's experience of their kidney disease experience. So in particular, since it hasn't been called out, I would encourage, in an ideal situation, measuring how patients with advanced chronic kidney disease in a transplant are managed, and in particular, ways in which these patients can be safely repatriated to dialysis without crashing into dialysis, with having their CKD parameters managed appropriately, having modality selection discussed proactively so that they can return to dialysis in a safe fashion, which ultimately is a necessary but not sufficient condition for being listed for retransplantation when and where that's appropriate. And then, again, rigorously keeping to time, I want to make sure that that the patients in the room really know that folks here are listening to you. Payers are listening to you. Regulators are listening to you. And transplant professionals are listening to you. What I would encourage the patients in the room is when transplant professionals point out worries about unintended consequences from whatever gets decided in this conference, that you listen to them. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with them. But as Tom Duvall mentioned yesterday, it's at least as important to identify metrics that incentivize behavior as it is to identify metrics that may have unintended and undesirable consequences. I would submit that the last 12 years from 2007 to 2019 resulted in a regulatory regime that caused transplant centers to discard too many organs and deprive too many patients of functioning transplants. My fervent hope as a referring physician and someone who took care of transplantations as part of their entire clinical career is that we don't repeat that history. And with that, I'll turn it back over, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you.
Taz?
Jody, do you want to
Just
introduce
introduce
yourself?
myself. Okay, thanks. My name is Jody Jones. I am a clinical psychologist and have worked in the transplant field now for over 20 years. I'm also a living kidney donor, and although I so strongly believe in what we do and feel privileged to have been part of the transplant community all this time, my movement towards becoming a living donor was not straightforward. Obviously, I'm not a typical donor in the fact that I am a member of a transplant team, and so I did have access to SRTR information and knew all about the program outcomes and volumes and things like that that some people might ask. I already knew all that part of it, so I was feeling confident in terms of my choice of program and how that was going to happen. I
did not know anything about my surgeon, who was new to our program, and I'm astonished at the number of people that are willing to come forward as potential living donors who have this organ they were born with and say, here, take it, do what you will with it, based on meeting us for a single day. I'm not that person, so I definitely wanted to know more, and fortunately my best friend's a transplant surgeon and was able to help me vet the guy that was going to do this, and so I, again, was able to feel pretty confident about what I was doing. I wanted to know things like how will my donation affect me given my particular history. I'll have to admit, being here as a transplant professional, it's difficult to sort of separate out the what from the how, and so I'm going to try not to do any problem solving here and just talk about things that I was interested in knowing or would like to know, but I recognize that some of the things I'm bringing up are not exactly discrete variables that are easy to measure. I was very fortunate in that one question I did not have to ask was, how is this going to get paid for? How is my job going to be protected? State of Iowa actually grants us 6 weeks paid time off if you're an organ donor, and it's unfortunate that there are not more businesses, companies, states that are willing to provide that. So I was lucky I didn't have to ask that question, but that is a big what for a lot of donors. I also was curious about what would happen if I, develop kidney failure and end up needing a transplant myself. And okay, I'm just going to admit this. I've worked in transplant for over 20 years. I've now been a post donor for 3.5. I don't know the answer to this in terms of when they say, well, you'll be made a priority. Does that mean that you gain a certain number of years on the list? Does it just mean you go to the top of your list, whether it's typically a 3, 5, 8, 10 year? I figured I would just go ahead and share my ignorance with you instead of figuring this out before I came here to the conference, but maybe someone can enlighten me about that. Like probably a lot of other donors, I think I rely on this faith that I did this for someone and someone would step up and do this for me if I found myself in that situation. I don't know that that's the case, but that's kind of where I put my faith. I am a very big believer in providers sharing personal experience about outcomes and things like that. Not necessarily your life story, but I do appreciate it when a surgeon and nephrologist, whoever, can say, well, in my experience, in my career, I've seen this number of things happen. These are the kinds of complications I have worked with, or the number of times that things have not gone well. So I think that that's really important. As was brought up earlier, you don't know what you don't know, and that was actually a huge theme as I was thinking about what I was going to say today. Even having worked in the field for so long, I didn't know what I didn't know, and I think a lot of it, I feel bad that as a psychologist there were some questions that I have not asked people up until I went through the experience myself, and it has a lot more to do with the psychological side of things, actually. I did not ask enough questions about my recovery, and I don't know if the information would have been available to me. Here's the thing about it. It's a physical process, it's cognitive, and it's emotional. The physical is obvious. Cognitively, you go in healthy. A lot of us have never had any kind of real surgery before, so you kind of know, well, it's going to sort of hurt somewhere. You know that you're going to wake up not feeling good, but then there's that emotional experience of waking up not feeling good. And I can tell you that, I remember waking up several different times after the surgery, and the first rational thought that I had after waking up in the PACU and being asked where I was, and I said I was in a New York City nightclub. Really. The first thought I had was, this is not what I expected. And I just, I felt horrible. I felt sick. I felt completely bloated and like I was going to throw up, and I just felt sick. I guess in my head I've been thinking I'm going to feel pain in certain places, but it wasn't like that. I mean, it just felt like a mess, and you're trying to dig your way out of the anesthesia, and it was just miserable. And then in the ensuing days, as you start kind of coming through some of this, you still feel awful. And then you're like, all of a sudden it seemed like my blood pressure was too high and there were other things going on. And I thought, I did this to myself. I fought for this. And so it's embarrassing. And I have to say, as a psychologist, I regret all of the years that I told potential donors, well, here's the one definite benefit that comes to the donor is that you have this psychological experience of knowing that you've done this thing, that it's a really good thing. In truth, I was sitting there going, what have I done to myself? I mean, I'm so thrilled that Jim, he's a family member, I donated to somebody that I know and love, was doing great, but I thought, what does this mean for me now? All of a sudden the reality of it was really hitting. And so, I actually recently saw the psychologist who did my psych eval 4 years ago, and he said, I've never asked you this, and I don't want to get too personal, but how did your donation experience go? And I said, well, it was more challenging than I had expected. It was more uncomfortable and just difficult in some ways. And he said, well, at least you had the knowledge that Jim was doing great. And I said to him, and these are all true things, you are a good friend, a good father, you're a good husband, you're a wonderful dog owner, you do these amazing things in your life. Does that make you feel better when you have the flu? And it doesn't. So that's the thing, is you're just doing the right thing. You feel like you just did what you needed to do. And so there's not even that little high that you get. And I am thrilled every day that Jim eats all the bananas and baked potatoes that he wants. That makes me happy. It makes me so happy. But that's not the kind of thing that was actually going to get me through this really difficult and challenging time afterwards. So, I think one of the things that would be really helpful is understanding better, if I had known, recovery is such a long process. We talk about it in terms of the days and the weeks following, and then we go, yeah, we'll be following you at six months, 1 year, 2 years. The healing goes on and on and on. My body continues to change. I didn't appreciate how much I was going to continue healing, and the things like Amy Waterman brought up about the woman that wanted to wear the bikini. That wasn't a really thought in my mind, but all this bloating and stuff that you carry around forever, I can't tell you the number of people that come to me now and say, is this normal? Do I have a hernia? And I realize that there's just so much more that I could have asked but didn't know, maybe because nobody was talking about it and nobody knew. And so, again, trying not to get into the how here, but I do think about all the ways that we can better educate and the things that I could do to make it better. Thank you for your time.
Good morning. My name is Morgan Reed. I'm the Director of Transplant Policy and Strategy with the National Kidney Foundation. Before joining NKF, I worked for 2 organ procurement organizations, the New Jersey Sharing Network and LifeLink of Georgia. I also had the privilege of working for Emory Transplant Center. I always joke and say my name is Morgan, rhymes with organ. I'm an organ recipient, Organ Morgan, you can't forget my name. But thank you so much to the SRTR team for inviting me to speak here on this panel. As you all probably know, the National Kidney Foundation is a patient advocacy organization. We appreciate SRTR amplifying patient voices, and to the patients that are in the audience, the virtual audience and the in-person audience. You probably heard me share yesterday that I am a kidney recipient, so I know what it's like to go through. I've been diagnosed with chronic kidney disease. I have experienced organ failure. I found out at 21 that my kidneys had failed. I did not have health insurance at the time, because back then, when you turned 21, you were kicked off your parents' healthcare insurance. I was hanging out with my aunt, and I remember saying to her, I don't feel normal. I don't feel like myself. And she asked me, well, when's the last time you checked your blood pressure? I was 21. I thought I was invincible. I didn't know the last time I checked my blood pressure. So we go to the grocery store. I sit down at a blood pressure cuff, and my blood pressure read 228 over 160. We go to the emergency room, and the emergency room physician shares with me that I am in kidney failure and I need to go on dialysis. My creatinine was 18. I had cerebral edema, grade 4 retinopathy. I was very sick. I started peritoneal dialysis shortly thereafter. I was on PD just shy of 2 years. My best friend in college, again, donated her kidney to me, and I did PD manually 4 times a day for about 3 to 4 months before switching over to the cycler. But I share this story because there are so many other stories like it. And as Amin said, it's very important that we humanize this data. There are stories, there are faces behind the data, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters. So it's really important that as we get swept up in metrics that we realize that there are people behind these numbers. Stop it. There is one quote that guides me in the work that I do every day. And that is, to the world you may be one person, but to one person you may be the world. And there's one thing that bonds us all here today, and that is our passion that fuels us for patients to get them onto and hopefully off of the transplant waitlist. So at the National Kidney Foundation, we have a kidney advisory committee that is comprised of amazing, dedicated patients. And so I reached out to them to ask them, what is it that you would want to know about transplant? What do your families want to know about transplant? So I'm going to share with you a list of 20 things. I'll go quickly, I promise. But these, I'm representing our patient advocates and sharing the thoughts and the things that they would want to know about transplant. So here we go. The first thing is patients want to know demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of referred patients, the number of referrals from dialysis centers and nephrologists. Patients are interested in knowing annual waitlist patient deaths, including cause of death, and demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of those patients, the number of preemptive transplants, the number of self-referrals. Patients are interested in knowing insurance coverage percentages, wait times by blood type, the percentage of places where patients are discharged, such as long-term care facilities, homes, rehab. Average length of stay per organ, including ICU admission. Reasons for organ failure. Are patients going into organ failure because of recurring disease? Are they going into organ failure because of loss of healthcare coverage or recurring disease? The percent of declined organs and the reason why. Percent of transplants from extended criteria donors, maybe patients with positive serologies or advanced age. Living donor mortality rates. Percent of patients referred who completed the evaluation. Demographic of patients denied access to the waitlist. Health equity is an important thing that we should all be considering. Percent of patients referred that are actually placed on the transplant waitlist. Average time from referral to evaluation, average time from evaluation to listing. Average time from listing to transplant, and also patients are interested in quality of life metrics. So if SRTR can figure out any quality of life metrics. It's one thing to receive an organ and be sick and having to go to the doctor, and it's another to receive a transplant and actually have quality of life, and that is what patients are looking for. At NKF, our hope is that these metrics will increase access to the transplant waitlist, maximize not only the recovery of organs, but transplanted organs, minimize organ discards, drive performance improvement, and increase and promote patient centricity. These are our policy priorities at the National Kidney Foundation. We would also recommend, and we've heard this a few times today, but at NKF we would recommend ensuring that all patients are aware of SRTR. Sharing information that is digestible in simple language that's easy to understand. Sharing data in as close to real time as possible. And we at NKF are always promoting and advocating for data transparency in hopes that it will either create or reinforce public trust and assurance in our transplant system. Patients deserve as much information as possible to be able to make informed decisions about their care and where they feel they would receive the best care. So I just want to say thank you again for allowing me to speak on behalf of the patients at NKF and on behalf of the people that are here in the room and again on the Zooms. It is an honor to be here to represent in this fashion. So thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much for bringing that home. We have about 5 minutes for Q&A, so again, if you're online, you can. I hope I will see them today. I'm sorry, yesterday I couldn't see them. Please come up to the microphone. I'll give a shout out. The first time I woke up from anesthesia, apparently I told all the staff how much I loved them. I also, as a nephrologist, apparently decided I wasn't nerdy enough, so I got additional statistical training, but fell in love with qualitative research as well because your whole job is to hear and understand people's stories. So maybe we've converted a few people in the room. Yes, thank you.
Hello, I'm Loren Davis. I'm from Oklahoma City, and I am with TRIO, Transplant Recipients International Organization. I'm also newly a Patient Affairs Committee for Region 4. And I'm not as nervous today, so that's why my voice is not shaking. But you know, we talk about organs declined and organs discarded. The problem is you have people on the wait list. They go in, they get prepped, the organs are declined or whatever, and they're at their all-time high, nervous, and then all of a sudden you're not getting the transplant. That is grief. And we don't talk about that grief. We talk about a dry run. Well, for a transplant patient, that is our life. And that is very impactful to know how long. I mean, I've got one lady that is 2 years on the transplant list. She's seen other people get a transplant, but she understands she's got to be sick enough to go through the transplant. But the problem is sometimes she wants to give up. But she has other people to talk to, so that helps her get through the process. And, you know, for the encouragement to keep going. But I think that's something that we don't see. That's important for us to hear and not just it's a dry run, because it may be for the transplant center, but it's not for us. So, thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Byford. I'm the manager for transplant quality and compliance at Froedtert Hospital. I'll try to make this quick. Back in 2019, I got a call from my dad, and he said that he had some lab results from an annual exam that he has every single year, but that this year he had an acronym next to one of his lab values, and it said CKD3. And he asked me, because I'm a nurse by background, what does that mean? And I was like, well, didn't the doctor tell you? And he said, no, the doctor just said to drink more water. So that is the night that I told my dad that he had chronic kidney disease and what that meant, and that he would have to see a nephrologist, which he had never heard of. He didn't know what a nephrologist was, except that he had seen something about a kidney doctor on a pamphlet, okay? So I directed him. Once again, I knew about all of this data. I was working at UNOS at the time. So I said, okay, go to the SRTR website, go to the UNOS website, look at this data. And about a year later, he came back to me, and we were in the kitchen, and he looked over at me and he said, Hannah, I looked at the data, and I don't want to be hooked up to a machine for the rest of my life, and I'm not going to get a kidney in time. Like, it's going to take 7-8 years. So I've decided that I'm not going to. So my dad has chosen death. That's very difficult to swallow. But what I want to know from the panelists is that there's a ton of data out there, but how do we use this data to craft a positive message so that people like my father don't look at this data and say, I don't want to go through this, but that, hey, there's hope at the end of the tunnel. Yes, not everything looks good, but it's worth pursuing. I don't know if that'll ever come in time for my father. I doubt it does. I really hope it does, but right now he's living on borrowed time. So from the panelists here, how do you craft that positivity out of data?
I think they're punting to me. I don't know the answer to that question. My answer would be that we start trying and we continue our patient engagement so that everything we create, we run through and by patients so that we can get the message and color the data, put the humans behind the data, and actually have the data drive what we're trying to accomplish.
So, Rich Formica, a transplant nephrologist from Yale. Maybe this ties into your question, but maybe it doesn't entirely, so go with that. But so I wanted to share with you two thoughts that came to me listening to this session in regards to the goal of this conference, right? And the first was, honestly, any of us, including the providers, could use that SRTR website to be updated in plain language with question-driven things. Like, let's be honest, like I go there all the time, I love it, I can't find a thing. But the second thing in listening to, and this ties in to what Amin was saying, there's a lot of discussion about stories, and the more important stories are actually the patients behind the stories. But we need to become better storytellers. And what I mean by that is not making things up and being honest with people about what is the reality, but telling it in a story, sort of like a Neil deGrasse Tyson telling you about the universe versus just regurgitating data, right? So if the SRTR can tell a better story in a way that we can be entertained, engaged, I think that would get us a long way towards achieving this goal of making it a more patient-driven, patient-centric approach. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for the comment about providers needing the roadmap as well. I would also comment, we've talked about patients making emotional decisions. Providers also make emotional decisions. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Kevin Fowler from Tulare and living with a kidney transplant. Just want to amplify why patient-reported outcome measures are important. So from my standpoint, I feel like it's a way that for the community to be heard. And from my perspective, looking at 18 years almost, I don't feel like the community's been heard. So I think that's one thing that I think just to think about that. So I think that that's why it's so important to make that a priority. And it's not just the first year to have patient-reported outcomes, but throughout the process, because there's a lot of things happening to our bodies that if we're communicating, it can help physicians make diagnoses, technology and so forth are going to come forward to help keep us alive and thrive. And so I would just say that's one thing, is that's why it's important, is we need to be heard, and there needs to be more of a dialogue versus a monologue. And for a long time, there was a monologue, just to be honest. Let's just lay it out at what it is. The other thing, too, is to make this authentic, is we need to have a patient voice strategy. Not just having people appear one and done, but a strategy, coherent strategy in all of transplant. So I know that's going to be accomplished now, but to think about the community is here to solve problems, and that's what our role is, not just to make an appearance, but to solve sustainable problems. Thanks.
Awesome, thanks. I'm making an executive decision because I know that at least the next two people are patients. We are over time, so Mr. Knight, can you
be quick?
Yeah.
I'll be very quick. Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Knight. I'm the president of the American Association of Kidney Patients. I've served on the SRTR Review Committee, and I'm thankful for them allowing me to do that, as well as service as Allison's co-chair. The thing I want to emphasize is that it's a very difficult job doing what SRTR has to do in terms of making information available and making it make sense. I've been an educator since 1983, teaching graduate and undergraduate courses. My area is business, and I know a little bit about communicating. You may tell someone something, that doesn't mean that they understand it. So I'm just going to emphasize that as patients, we need to be more engaged. As some of my professional colleagues here, we need to try to do a better job of listening to the patients. I've spoken with a lot of you, and I appreciate the respect that you accord us, but there are many times where people think we don't understand. And I like to say, just because I don't agree doesn't mean that I don't understand. As a patient, I'm 16 years out of my transplant, and I'm one of the fortunate ones. I didn't go through what a lot of people went through, and I worked 10, 12 hours while I was on dialysis. But for a lot of my colleagues, it's not that easy. And I want to make certain that we've had a talented group of patients up here. Well, I also want you to be aware that, we work with, and we need to do a better job of working with the patients that aren't talented, that aren't familiar with the system, that aren't professionals, that don't understand the language. Where I go to some places in DC and downtown Baltimore, you would think no one's ever been there. It's a tragedy in terms of what some of these patients go through. When I ask them, how long have you been on dialysis? 2 years. And no one's talked to you about a transplant. And if somebody says something to me about conditions of coverage one more time, I'm gonna throw a chair at you, because that doesn't really mean anything in many of these facilities. So I'll stop there, Allison, but we're looking forward to continued conversation. I do have my colleagues, Dale Rogers, pancreas, kidney transplant, David Rodriguez, kidney and liver, recent liver transplant. So we're here, they're with AKP as well, and we're gonna be very active in the breakout sessions because they've been tame during this, as have I. But I applaud everyone being here, and I look forward to us continuing this, not just stopping here. We want to continue this, and thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Merle, and I'm a heart recipient, 15 years out. Didn't do anything special to be here other than survived. And I want to talk about my transplant, and we talked on this a lot. It's not just the physical devastation that occurs as a part of your illness. Emotionally, financially, everything is basically wiped out if you have a long-term chronic illness. I had heart failure for 11 years. So at the time of my transplant, I was happy to get listed. It was a blessing to get listed, because what they don't tell you about the subway is that there are subway police there, and they will not only not let you get on the train, they will kick you off the train on your journey, and you may have to start over again. And the other thing that I think most patients need to hear, you don't have any control over the process. You can look at all this data all you want to and make all the calculations in your brain that you think you need to, but at the end of the day, the system gives you the token to get on the subway. You can't go buy a token, you can't find one, you can't get one from a friend unless it's a living kidney donor or something like that. But with heart transplants specifically, there is no living donor. And I think a lot of our discussion today has been kidney-centric, and rightfully so. They represent the largest portion of people on the wait list, and I understand that. But ECMO is a lot different than dialysis, and the journey is different depending on the organ type you're getting, and so are the outcomes. And I think that's important too, to filter specifically by organ type, but also to let them know that you can look at all this data, but you don't have any control over the process. And once you realize that, and once I realized that, that's where I had some serenity about the process. Just kind of accept it, let the system do what it does, quit trying to control the outcome, because I was kind of headstrong. And the more I tried to control the system, the more frustrated and angry I got. And nobody wants to work with an angry patient. So I'll just leave it like that. You have to advocate for yourself, but within limits. You can't control the process, but you can speak up for yourself. But at the end of the day, the system does what it does. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for reminding me, we had a thoracic recipient that was going to come and talk to us today, but couldn't come. So thank you for pointing out this was a very kidney-centric discussion this morning.
I will be
Bring
very
us
brief,
home.
Dr.
No,
Allison.
I'm so excited that you, yes.
I felt compelled to come up after I heard, what's your name? I'm sorry. Hannah speak, and I'm so sorry about your father. I will be praying for him. My answer to that is two things. Miracles do happen, and also tell stories, as someone else said. And I just want to finish the other part of my story because I didn't say it up there briefly. When we got to the hospital and they gave us the list of the 5 people that my son's major organs were going to, my husband at that moment said, "Doesn't our attorney need a kidney?" And I said, "Yeah, but you cannot pick the person." And the nurse said, "Yes, you can, if they're a match." So they didn't tell me any information, but they looked him up, and he had actually gone off the list for 2 weeks because he had a cold or something. This is what I found out later. But anyways, he was a match because my son had a certain blood type. And when he called me 25 minutes later crying, "I'm so sorry for your loss, but your son is a match." It knocked me out of the water. It still does, because that is a miracle. So your father hearing a story that this man had been waiting 4 years on the list. His son could have did it. Anybody else could have done it, but they never asked. But my son was the match. And he's never given me a bill since, as my attorney. But miracles happen is what I wanted to say. So, tell the story, let them tell the story and other stories, and people will know that even though statistics show one thing, that miracles do happen. So I just wanted to say that. Yeah, pray for you. Thanks.
That was a really outstanding way to kick off our first breakout session. There are a couple of quick logistics that I'd like to go through. I'll try to get through it really quickly so we can get started. So I'm going to focus on the virtual folks first. So if you are joining virtually, this includes the moderators who will join virtually, even if you're here. To access the correct session, you will want to go to the home page, and at the top right, you'll see a calendar icon. That is your My Schedule icon. Go to that, and then you will get a pop-up at the very bottom of the pop-up. It will say, "View your full schedule." This is your personalized schedule, and you've been personalized. You are assigned to your personalized group, so that if you scroll down, you will find the link to the session you are assigned to. If you click the name of Breakout Session 1, first there is a button that will say Remove. Do not click Remove. That will mean you can't get to it. Click the name of that session. 5 minutes before the start time, there will be a button that says Join. The moderators will click Join as host, and the rest will join as attendees. If you are an attendee, know that the host must join first, so please be patient. It might take a few minutes for one of your moderator hosts to log in and kick things off. We walked through some of the logistics yesterday, so we will want to record these sessions, the virtual sessions. Please help your moderators remember to do that. They have the instructions, or hopefully you can work that out. Try to rely on the chat. We know there'll be hopefully enough time for everyone to speak, but maybe not to cover everything they want to share. The chat is a way to do that without stepping on each other's toes. So with that, I'll switch to am I missing something?
Because we really want time in those breakout sessions, and we're going to be starting a little late. We're going to cut into the report back because we're going to cut into the report back. So shift your schedule forward 15 minutes because the breakout session should start now. We know it's going to take time for people to grab a snack, go to the bathroom, and get to your session.
Great, thank you. So yes, the end time for the breakout will be additional 15 minutes so that we do have the full 90-minute session. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears. For the in-person individuals, you will all have in your packets a printout for breakout session room assignments. There is a list in this printout that has everyone's name on it. If you find your name, you will see what breakout sessions you have been assigned to. They will say something like 1A, 1B, and that is your group. On the first page, there is a key that says, 1A1 will meet at such and such room. So find that room, and that will be the location you should go to right now after we're done. Just as a quick guide, if you are in a group that is in the lakes room, it's C or D. You will exit this room, immediately take a left, and those two rooms are immediately to our left. Lakes C and D. If you are in Lakes Ballroom, that's right here. There are two groups. There's group one. Let's have you, group one, go to this side, and group two go to this side. We'll just rearrange chairs. We'll park here. If you are in Nokomis C and B, those are on the third floor. You will exit the room, go down the lobby area, past the lounge with the red chairs, and go up one floor, either elevator or stairs. Nokomis C and B are up right there, past the red chairs. If you are in Cedar, you'll exit this room, go past the lobby, and just keep going straight down the next hall. There is a sign that is pointing toward the hallway with Cedar. Inside each room, there'll be a flip chart. We talked about that a little bit. There's also some extra worksheets. Everyone should have a worksheet in your packet. Use those. If you are missing your sheet, there are a small number of spares that will be set out. So again, we want everyone to take a few minutes to write down things individually, use those sheets, and then also speak up, interact, have a discussion. We'll use the flip charts to capture some of that and then do the prioritization. And we look forward to hearing in the breakout how everything went. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay, cool. Sweet.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Of course,
Yeah,
yeah.
I have something to ask you, so before the conference is over, don't let me forget.
Okay, yeah, I'll hold you to that. So, okay. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.